You're listening to The Reclaimed Life, a podcast about recognizing manipulation, reclaiming your voice, and rebuilding a life that actually feels like your own. I'm Rachel Paxton, an author, ordained chaplain, and certified mental health coach. And each week I'll explore the patterns, dynamics, and turning points that help people rediscover who they truly are. Today's episode is called What Does It Mean to Reclaim Your Life? Because sometimes the moment you start recognizing manipulation, control, or unhealthy patterns in your life is the very moment you begin finding your voice again. Hello, and welcome to The Reclaimed Life. If you're here, there's a good chance that at some point in your life, something stopped making sense. Maybe it was a relationship, maybe it was a workplace or a community, maybe it was a system you trusted. Or maybe it was simply a pattern you kept noticing in different areas of your life. Something fell off, and at first it may have been difficult to name, because manipulation and control rarely appear obvious at the beginning. In fact, many controlling dynamics begin with things that look very normal, even good: support, guidance, leadership, care. But over time, something begins to shift. You start feeling smaller. You start second guessing yourself more often. You start wondering why your voice seems to carry less weight than it used to. And slowly, a quiet question begins forming somewhere inside you. Why does this feel wrong? One of the reasons these dynamics can be so difficult to recognize is because manipulation rarely feels like manipulation at first. Often it feels like influence, or concern, or even love. Someone might say they're trying to help you. They might say they're guiding you. They might say that they simply want what is best for you. And sometimes those things are true. But in unhealthy dynamics, something subtle begins to happen over time. The guidance slowly becomes pressure. The concern slowly becomes criticism. And the relationship begins shifting from mutual respect to quiet control. Because it happens gradually, many people don't recognize the shift until much later. They just know something feels different. Something feels heavier. Something feels harder to explain. For many people, the loss of self doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly. Through environments where certain voices carry more authority than others. Through relationships where your needs are consistently minimized. Through situations where questioning is subtly discouraged and conformity is quietly rewarded. Over time, something important begins happening beneath the surface. People begin doubting themselves. They stop trusting their instincts. They override that internal signal that says, something here isn't right. And instead of listening to that signal, they begin adjusting themselves. Adjusting to keep the peace. Adjusting to maintain the relationship. Adjusting to remain part of the group. Little by little, their sense of self begins to fade. But eventually something begins to change. Maybe you start noticing patterns. Maybe you begin learning about manipulation tactics. Maybe you recognize dynamics like gaslighting, guilt, or emotional control. Or maybe you simply begin paying attention to how you feel after certain conversations or interactions. And suddenly, things that once felt confusing begin to make sense. That moment can be incredibly disorienting. Because when you start recognizing unhealthy dynamics, you also begin realizing how much of yourself you may have been adapting just to survive within them. And that realization can bring a mix of emotions: relief, anger, grief, clarity, sometimes all at once. Another thing many people begin noticing during this process is how powerful language can be. Certain phrases often get repeated again and again in manipulative environments. Things like, you're overthinking, you're too sensitive, you're misunderstanding, you're remembering that wrong. At first, those phrases may seem small, but when they're repeated often enough, they begin reshaping how a person sees themselves. Instead of trusting their own experience, they begin assuming the other person must be right. Over time, this creates something psychologists sometimes call self doubt conditioning. A person stops trusting their internal signals. They begin filtering their thoughts through someone else's approval. And once that happens, manipulation becomes much easier to maintain, which is why recognizing these patterns can feel so liberating. because the moment you recognize the pattern, the spell begins to break. Awareness is often the first step towards reclaiming your life, because once you begin recognizing manipulation or control, you can't really unsee it. You begin noticing behaviors you once dismissed. You begin recognizing patterns that once felt normal. And most importantly, you begin reconnecting with something that may have been quiet for a very long time: your own voice. Reclaiming your life doesn't mean everything changes overnight. Most of the time, it happens slowly. It begins with small shifts, paying attention to your intuition, allowing yourself to question things that once felt questionable, learning about boundaries, learning to trust your perceptions again, and perhaps most importantly, learning that your thoughts, feelings, and perspective actually matter. Something else that often surprises people is that reclaiming their life doesn't always look dramatic from the outside. It rarely starts with a huge confrontation or a sudden exit. More often, it begins with quiet changes. You start noticing how conversations affect you. You begin paying attention to when your energy drops after certain interactions. You allow yourself to pause before automatically agreeing to things. You begin asking yourself simple but powerful questions. Do I actually want this? Do I actually agree with this? Or have I simply been going along with it for a long time? These small moments of honesty can begin rebuilding something incredibly important: self trust. And once self trust begins returning, everything else begins to change. As clarity grows, something interesting begins to happen. You start rediscovering parts of yourself that may have been buried: your opinions, your preferences, your boundaries, your ability to think independently, and often your curiosity about life returns. You begin asking new questions. What do I actually want? What do I believe? What kind of life feels aligned with who I really am? These questions can feel uncomfortable at first, but they're also incredibly powerful because they signal that something important is happening. You're reconnecting with yourself. And something else begins to change as well. At first, recognizing manipulation or unhealthy dynamics can feel overwhelming. You may look back at past situations and suddenly see things more clearly. Moments that once felt confusing begin to make sense. Patterns you couldn't explain become more obvious, and sometimes people worry this awareness will make them cynical or guarded. But something different usually happens. Clarity doesn't make people harder, it makes them wiser. Because when you begin recognizing unhealthy dynamics, you also begin recognizing healthy ones. You begin noticing relationships where respect flows both directions, conversations where you feel heard instead of dismissed, environments where questions are welcome instead of discouraged. And those experiences begin teaching you something powerful. Healthy influence never requires you to shrink yourself. Healthy relationships don't depend on confusion, and genuine respect never asks you to silence your own voice. And that is really what reclaiming your life is about. It's not about becoming someone completely new. It's about returning to the person you were before layers of pressure, control, or expectations began shaping you into someone else. It's about remembering that your voice matters, your experiences matter, your intuition matters, and your life was never meant to be lived entirely according to someone else's script. For many people, this process unfolds in stages. First comes awareness, then comes understanding, then comes the slow work of rebuilding trust with yourself, and eventually something else begins to emerge: confidence. Not loud confidence, not performative confidence, but a quiet internal stability that comes from knowing you can trust your own discernment again. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself somewhere in this journey, maybe you're beginning to notice patterns you hadn't seen before. Maybe you're questioning dynamics that once felt normal. Maybe you're simply realizing that parts of your life no longer feel aligned with who you are becoming. I want you to know something. That moment of realization is not a weakness. It's not overreacting, and it's not a failure. Very often, it's the beginning of clarity, and clarity is where reclaiming your life begins. This podcast exists for people in that space, people who are recognizing manipulation or unhealthy dynamics, people who are learning how to set boundaries, people who are rediscovering their voice, and people who are slowly rebuilding a life that actually feels like their own. If you've ever felt like your voice was muted, if you ever felt like you had to shrink yourself to keep the peace, or if you've ever realized that the life you were living didn't quite feel like your life anymore, you're not alone and you're not imagining things. You may simply be at the beginning of reclaiming your life. Thank you for listening to The Reclaimed Life. If something in this episode resonated with you, you're not alone. Many people are beginning to recognize unhealthy patterns in relationships, systems, and environments, and discovering that reclaiming their voice is possible. In future episodes, I'll explore topics like recognizing manipulation, understanding narcissistic dynamics, rebuilding self trust, and learning how to create a life that actually feels like your own. If you'd like to explore more of these ideas, you can visit my website at thereclaimlifepodcast.com, where I share additional writing, resources, and future episodes of the show. Until next time, take a moment to listen to your intuition, trust what you're beginning to see, and remember that reclaiming your life often begins with one honest question. This is The Reclaimed Life.